Tonight on Ukraine Today, a peaceful meeting in Miami. What will US and Ukrainian representative discuss? And was there any breakthrough during the talks in Moscow? Telling moves from the occupiers. How Putin and his invading army responded to the idea that Russia wants peace. Foreign military production. Denmark has made a decision that may reshape Europe's entire defense architecture. Russification and North Korean-style. Ukrainian children kidnapped by Russia are sent to military camps in North Korea. All that and more, right now. Hi there, I'm Volodymyr Robchun and this is Ukraine Today. Please hit subscribe, drop a like and let's jump into the news. Ukrainian drones struck the Nevinnomysk Azot chemical plant in Russia's Stavropol region, one of the suppliers of chemical components for the occupying army. In other words, it's an absolutely legitimate target. It was also allowed last night in the Russian city of Oryol. Over the past 24 hours, Russia lost at least 1,140 troops killed and wounded. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, that's now 1,177,370 invaders. In the last day alone, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 3 Russian tanks, 3 armored fighting vehicles, 29 artillery systems and dozens of other pieces of enemy equipment. More on the battlefield situation in our report.
Don't say hop until you've jumped over. A Ukrainian proverb that perfectly describes the current situation for the Russian Federation on the Lyman front. Here, the occupiers managed to advance a little, which they immediately reported, Z war correspondents. But they are obviously also read by Ukrainian intelligence, thanks to which the SU received operational data that they immediately put to use.
I would like to thank the Russian war correspondent, Timofey Ermakov. He spoke about our positions on his Telegram channel. Thanks to this, the Ukrainians found us and took the flank. They killed.
At the same time, the heaviest fighting on the front traditionally takes place in the Pokrovsk area. A high-ranking NATO official stated that the Russians control 95% of the city. In Ukraine, however, they explained that in the west, gray zones are often attributed to the occupiers, without fully understanding the specifics of the fighting.
Today, the Russians control most of Pokrovsk. Today, most of the city is occupied by the so-called gray zone. Today, the Russians are trying to disrupt our logistics as much as possible, including those of the Mirnograd garrison, since this is a single Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration. However, in any case, even today, despite all the Russians' efforts, the Pokrovsk operation continues.
At the same time, for several weeks now, Putin has been blindly repeating that Pokrovsk is completely under Russian control. According to Sky News, Russia deliberately announced the capture of Pokrovsk ahead of negotiations with the US, which took place on December 2nd. However, in reality, the situation is quite different. Moreover, the Vostok troop grouping reported that the defense forces are organizing additional logistical routes to supply their units in Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, where intense fighting continues. And in the city itself, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to eliminate Russian occupiers in the urban areas.
The 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Ukrainian Air Assault Forces told Reuters that they are holding the northern part of Pokrovsk and conducting assault operations in the southern part, where Russian troops predominate.
Another settlement that remains in the headlines is Kupiansk. Despite daily attempts by the Russians to change the situation here, they have not succeeded. The initiative remains with the Ukrainian armed forces, and the clearing of enemy units is already taking place on the outskirts of the city. At the
moment, about 50 to 60% of the city is completely under the control of the defense forces, and another 20% is a gray zone. As always, the Special Operations Forces units performed excellently. They played an important role at the most critical moment.
Moreover, Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrskyi stated that the Ukrainian armed forces are not only destroying the enemy, but also cutting off the occupiers' logistical routes, including those the enemy uses to send in reserve forces.
There are no successes. Clearing operations are underway. And now, in fact, those very routes through which the enemy had established infiltration into Kupiansk have been blocked. This is actually This matches reality, because if it were otherwise, we would have seen changes to the map in Kupiansk, but there are no changes there.
Recently, alarming news has been coming from the Zaporizhzhia region. Our command acknowledges that the enemy has had some success there. However, the General Staff is making every effort to stabilize the situation. And according to analysts, the pace of the enemy's advance has already been significantly reduced.
Huliaipol, which the enemy was counting on entering. Right here and now, it continues to hold. Some Russian units that previously tried to infiltrate this settlement were destroyed. And in principle, in the near future, I think we will see the very stabilization of the front in this sector.
In total, over the past day, the enemy tried more than 200 times to storm the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces. More than 1,200 occupiers were eliminated in these attacks, as well as nearly 50 vehicles and more than a dozen artillery systems destroyed.
Today in Miami, U.S. negotiators Witkoff and Kushner are meeting the head of the Ukrainian delegation, NSDC Secretary Umerov. This was confirmed by Ukraine's ambassador to the U.S., Olga Stefanishyna. The meeting is another step in the talks about possible ways to end Russia's war.
From our side, from the Ukrainian state, there will be no obstacles and no delays. We are absolutely constructive. And moreover, we work very fast with our partners. Everyone notes this on the American side as well. We are preparing meetings in the United States of America after the American team returns from Moscow and after the relevant consultations in Washington. Rustem Umerov, Andriy Ignatov, and everyone needed for the negotiations will continue the conversation with President Trump's representatives. We are waiting for news in the coming days about these meetings, contacts, negotiations. Whether personal meetings or phone calls, there is constant contact between all partners and between the partners and Ukraine. Everything right now is moving forward quite productively. At the meetings in Geneva and in Florida, Ukraine was heard and Ukraine was listened to. And that is important. We expect that it will stay exactly like that.
Interestingly, Witkoff and Kushner cancelled their planned meeting with President Zelensky in Europe, the one that was supposed to take place right after the Moscow talks. The Americans, in fact, kept the promise they made to the Kremlin dictator and returned home straight from Russia. More on what is known about the meeting between the US negotiators and Putin next.
Negotiations regarding the peace plan between Putin, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner lasted almost 5 hours. An exchange of views between the American and Russian sides on the U.S. peace plan in this format took place for the first time in Moscow, and according to the Kremlin, there are positive developments.
No, it won't be right. It won't be right. The thing is, actually, this kind of direct exchange of views took place for the first time yesterday. And again, as was said yesterday, some things were accepted, some were deemed unacceptable. This is a normal working process, a search for compromise.
Putin is not rejecting the so-called Trump peace plan, but he is not agreeing to it either. Putin's special envoy Dmitriev described the talks with Witkoff and Kushner as productive. Witkoff has flown to Moscow for the 6th time this year, and apart from wasted time, there has been no major result. Russia is not ready to make any concessions and is standing its ground.
In other words, Russia said, yes, we are ready to accept a lot of points except for those that are fundamental for Ukraine. We know, in fact, that the same points are fundamental for both Russia and Ukraine, only in completely opposite directions. It is most likely impossible to work according to this plan, because for Ukraine these are also red lines. Everything else could suit both sides, but still, they can't come to an agreement.
At the same time as the meeting between Witkoff and Putin, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave an interview on Fox News. He said that right now, Ukraine and Russia are fighting over a territory the size of 20% of the Donetsk region, which is under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. And if these military actions are stopped and security is ensured, then in the near future, Ukraine can look forward to promising prospects.
Theoretically, if everything is done right, in 10 years, Ukraine's GDP could surpass that of Russia. The following things are needed to stop the war, to ensure that they are never invaded or attacked again, to protect Ukraine's long-term sovereignty and independence so that it does not become a puppet state, They are truly independent and sovereign, allowing their economy not just to recover, but to thrive and turn it into a story of prosperity.
It sounds beautiful in words, but at the moment no one is giving Ukraine such guarantees, and the pressure on Russia is not increasing. Therefore, only a strong Ukrainian army and successes on the battlefield are currently the only factors ensuring further success in negotiations with Russia. And for this, Ukraine needs as much military support as possible. By the end of the year, Ukraine will receive $5 billion worth of weapons under the Pearl program. Next year, support is expected to remain at the same level, according to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He expects that in 2026, Ukraine's partners will allocate $1 billion per month for the purchase of weapons.
We currently have $4 billion, so this means we are really on track for $1 billion per month. August, September, October, November. Next year, we will once again need a lot of money for the whole year. At least 1 billion, maybe even a little more than 1 billion per month. Maybe.
Lithuanian Foreign Minister Kęstutis Budrys is convinced that the US efforts for a peace agreement will not succeed. Russia is simply trying to convince the international community that violating fundamental international principles is normal.
If we recognize Russia's territorial gains, it instantly destroys international law. The consequence will be new attacks and even more threats, both for Russia's neighbors and everywhere else.
The offensive continues. They're biting off pieces of Ukrainian territory bit by bit. Russia's economic problems are not yet that critical. And so, as long as there are truly no grounds in the Kremlin for seeking peace, then in fact peace remains out of reach.
Now the negotiations will be put on hold, and at this moment it is very important that Russia does not achieve military successes at the front, but rather the opposite, in order to strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position.
US President Donald Trump isn't sure about the results of the Moscow talks, though in his view, Witkoff and Kushner got the impression that the Russian dictator wants to end the war.
Their impression was that he would like to see the war ended. I think he'd like to get back to dealing a more normal life. I think he'd like to be trading with the United States of America, frankly, instead of losing thousands of soldiers a week. But their impression was very strongly that he'd like to make a deal. We'll see what happens.
Well, I think the clearest sign of Putin's desire for peace is the behavior of his invading army. Last night, Ukrainian air defenses intercepted 114 out of 138 enemy drones across the north, south, and east. Russia also attacked with ballistic missiles and bombs. Probably peaceful ballistics, right? Anti-war drones and infrastructure restoring bombs, isn't it? Russia launched a massive strike on Slovyansk. One bomb hit a residential apartment building. We know of at least 8 injured people, including children. 6 people were injured in Odessa after another drone strike. Residential and administrative buildings were damaged. A fire broke out at an energy infrastructure facility. Yesterday evening, a Russian ballistic missile hit an administrative building in Kryvyi Rih. The blast wave damaged nearby residential blocks. One woman was injured. And if that's not enough, as a measure of Russia's peaceful intentions, here's more. The Kremlin has sent part of the kidnapped, abducted Ukrainian children to military camps in North Korea. Ukrainian human rights advocates reported this at a US Senate Appropriation Committee hearing. Russia calls the forced deportation of children evacuation, does not give the Red Cross any lists, does not explain where the kids are being detained, and does not allow voluntary return. Add to that Putin's statement to India today, where he said that Russia will liberate Donbass and Novorossiya, military or otherwise. Well, first, if we are already talking about so-called Novorossiya, then let's also recall Ukrainian Kuban, which is somehow still part of Russia. Second, yes, Donetsk and Luhansk regions must absolutely be liberated from Russian occupiers. And third, I wonder whether President Trump still feels Putin wants peace, or maybe he is once again disappointed in his Russian colleague. Could it be that Witkoff and Kushner were simply mistaken? By the way, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution demanding the immediate return of the abducted Ukrainian children. 91 countries voted in favor, 12 against, and 57 abstained. Who voted against, you may ask? Russia, Belarus, Burundi, Burkina Faso, Eritrea, Cuba, North Korea, Mali, Nicaragua, Niger, Iran, and Sudan. Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. Now is a perfect moment to subscribe, hit like, and share this video. Please do it. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. Italy is suspending its participation in the Pearl program for purchasing American weapons for Ukraine. Bloomberg reports that the country's foreign minister ties the decision to peace talks. As in, if the fighting stops, there will be no need for weapons anymore. Of course, absolutely logical. Fighting will stop, weapons will never be needed again. Russia will become peaceful and friendly to everyone. Iran too, along with their favorite terrorist groups. Sounds like a utopia though. And Russia is continuing the war. The fighting has not stopped, which means weapons are needed. Right now. Many countries understand that, including Australia and New Zealand. They officially joined Pearl and are allocating over $70 million in military assistance to Ukraine. The funds will go toward weapons, drones, and air defense radar systems. Denmark has made a decision that will influence Europe's entire defense architecture. For the first time ever, a NATO country has officially allowed Ukraine to set up military production on its territory. More about this project in our report.
A step that changes the entire architecture of European defense. For the first time in NATO's history, a member country of the alliance is officially allowing Ukraine to set up defense production on its territory.
The Danish government announced the project on September 3, 2025, calling it a helping hand for Ukraine in its ongoing struggle to preserve sovereignty and security amid the continuing conflict with Russia.
In the small Danish town of Vojens in southern Jutland, next to the Strudstrup airbase, where F-16s are on active duty, the first piles for the Ukrainian factory are being driven into the ground. This is much more than just the construction of another industrial facility. This is the architecture of future European security.
The best help we can give Ukraine right now is to support the Ukrainian defense industry. Ukraine must become even more self-sufficient, and by welcoming the first Ukrainian company in Denmark, we are taking another step in our support. This way, production will not be halted by Russian attacks, and at the same time, cooperation between Ukrainian and Danish companies will be strengthened.
The project is being implemented by the Ukrainian company Firepoint, known for developing the Flamingo missile, one of the most successful Ukrainian innovations in recent years. But in Denmark, they will not be producing missiles themselves, but rather their heart, the solid rocket fuel, a critically important component required by every long-range system, every interceptor, every complex currently targeting Russian military objectives.
Denmark stands shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. Their fight for freedom is our fight for freedom. Putin shows every day that he will not stop, so we must help the Ukrainians stop him. We are doing this by allowing Firepoint to establish itself in Denmark. At the same time, we are creating new, closer ties between the Danish and Ukrainian defense sectors and our companies. This contributes to our security and creates more opportunities for Danish companies to support Europe's defense and Ukraine's fight for freedom.
The location next to the airbase was chosen for a reason. It offers ready-made infrastructure and enhanced security, as well as the possibility of integration into NATO's common logistics routes. And Denmark is allocating 500 million kroner for this.
We are increasing the security of our own production. We understand that any production facility on the territory of Ukraine could be targeted by Russian missiles and simply destroyed.
Construction is scheduled to be completed in 2026. And when the plant begins operation, Europe will gain a new element of its security, Ukrainian in content and European in protection. This means that for the first time in years of war, a model will emerge in which defense support for Ukraine becomes not just a one-time impulse, but a long-term system.
The Danes understand all the problems caused by Russian shelling by the Russian invasion. They, like no one else, as Scandinavian countries, they understand this perfectly well, and that's why they are the ones who come to us first to meet us halfway. They are engaging in such joint initiatives, creating joint ventures, opening up production on their own territory to help to help Ukraine and in the future in the development of missiles. After all, the production of solid rocket fuel is just the first stage. I think the next step will be the deployment of both missiles and Ukrainian missile production on Danish territory.
Recently, Denmark has already allocated its 28th military aid package amounting to 1.4 billion kroner. 100 million kroner are allocated to finance weapons production in Ukraine under the so-called Danish model, a mechanism that Copenhagen devised itself and which is now becoming an example for other allies. This is when a partner country not only purchases weapons but also helps to develop production where it is truly needed in Ukraine, under Ukrainian control and for the Ukrainian army. Over 370 million more are being allocated for the purchase of American weapons for Ukraine through the Pearl Initiative, a mechanism that Denmark, Sweden and Norway first launched back in 2025 by supplying missiles for the Patriot systems. This is a direct strengthening of Ukraine's air defense in the coming months. A separate portion, 80 million kroner, will go toward fuel, which will be purchased through the NATO Support and Procurement Agency. It may seem like a small detail, but it's precisely such details that keep the army moving.
Finally, why Russian airlines are starting to look more and more like funeral agencies. In Russia, the number of incidents involving civilian aircraft has increased fourfold in a year. Sanctions over Russia's war against Ukraine are, of course, playing a key role. What's next, and could a real plane fall happen? More ahead.
Yes, we've flown enough. Russian civil aviation is visibly deteriorating.
I really doubt I can add anything more here at this point.
From January to the end of November 2025, the number of incidents involving Russian airline aircraft increased by about 4 times compared to the same period in 2024.
I've always said, and Vitaly Gennadievich can confirm this, that we need to pay more attention to purchasing domestic equipment. If we had done this in previous years, maybe things would be a bit easier now.
During this time, there have been over 800 recorded cases of malfunctions in the country that led to flight cancellations or emergency interruptions, whereas during the same period in 2024, there were no more than 200 such incidents.
Will we fly in Vladimir, and on what?
We will. Of course we will.
The only question is what we'll be flying on and how dangerous it will be. This year, there have been 2 accidents and 2 air disasters in Russian commercial aviation in which a total of 53 people died. According to the Moscow Times, the largest of these was the crash of an AN-24 aircraft operated by Angara Airlines at the end of July. The plane was manufactured in 1976.
This is primarily due to the deterioration of the technical condition of the Russian aviation fleet and Russian civil aircraft. That's it. Nevertheless, we see that, in fact, over the past year and actually at the beginning of this year, Russian civil aviation and civil aviation authorities have repeatedly appealed to ICAO, asking for sanctions against Russia to be lifted in order to allow access to Western components and spare parts for Boeing and Airbus aircraft, which actually carry 80 to 90% of all air traffic in Russia.
At the beginning of October, the head of Rosaviatsia stated that, according to the less optimistic forecast, Russia could lose 339 aircraft over the next 5 years, including 109 foreign-made planes. According to the agency, the total fleet of Russian airlines consists of just over 1,000 civil aircraft.
So overall, we're talking about an average of 50 to 60 aircraft being effectively withdrawn from service each year over the next 5 years. First of all. Secondly, we're essentially talking about more than half of the Western fleet that Russia is currently operating. According to various estimates, as of today, there are about 550 to 600 Western airliners in the fleet of the Russian Federation, about a third of which can no longer be used in regular operation, since frequent breakdowns or the lack of spare parts for repairs mean that these planes are effectively grounded or become victims of so-called aviation cannibalism.
After the war began, the Russian authorities decided to save the aviation industry and announced a program to revive the domestic aircraft industry. It was planned that the production of civil aircraft in the country would reach the level of the Soviet Union in just a few years, and that by 2030 companies would receive more than 1,000 domestically produced planes. But all of this turned out to be just words. At the beginning of 2025, the government decided to cut the aircraft production plan by 1.5 times.
we can see that the level and technologies required for the production of these aircraft and onboard systems are critically dependent on Russia's ability to purchase Western components, Western parts, Western technologies, and also the necessary manufacturing equipment for producing various components or systems.
In other words, if we look to the future, Russians won't be able to fly for much longer.
We observe that Russia persistently continues to utilize the so-called grey import mechanism, which essentially and effectively allows for the illicit re-exportation of crucial components and essential spare parts, circumventing international sanctions and controls. Firstly. Secondly, this leads to the installation of spare parts of unclear origin on aircraft, including parts that have already been used before. This leads to a decrease in flight safety, a continued increase in aviation equipment failures, and as a result, we will see a rise in the number of air crashes and consequently casualties associated with them.
The lifting of Western sanctions could save Russian civil aviation. However, such a scenario is currently impossible, and new aircraft require long-term orders, contracts spanning decades and worth billions of dollars, resources that Putin's Russia critically lacks because of the war.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share. See you next time.